Hi, I'm Anastasia Harman, host and researcher of World War II podcast Left Behind, which is about the personal stories of the people in the Philippines during World War II. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the origins of this podcast and why it's such an important project. Let's jump in. This is Alma Som. He was my great-grandfather. On December 8th, 1941, when World War II started in the Philippines, he was stationed on the ship USS Canopus, and it was anchored in Manila Bay. However, by late December 1941, it moved to a small harbor at the very south of Bataan Peninsula, which is where all U.S. troops were withdrawing to at that time in the war. The Canopus and my great-grandfather would remain at the bottom of the Bataan Peninsula until April 1942, when Bataan fell to Japanese forces. At that time, Som and the crew of the Canopus was sent to Corregidor Island, which was a small island off the coast of Bataan, and it became the last U.S. stronghold in the Philippines. On May 6, 1942, Japanese forces invaded the island. It fell within hours, and all the 10,000 or so men on this island became prisoners of war, including my great-grandfather. Shortly after Corregidor's fall, he was relocated to the Cabanatuan POW camps, which was also in the Philippines. This camp became the largest of the Japanese-held POW camps during World War II, and Som remained here for pretty much the remainder of the war, nearly 3 years, although he did spend time at the Nichols Field Work Camp. At this camp, prisoners were forced to build an airstrip by hand, and the main way that they were doing that was digging out the bottom of the hills until the hillside collapsed, and hopefully the POWs had retreated by that point, or they would have been buried alive. My great-grandfather called this a hellhole of a work camp. He was liberated along with about 500 other men from Cabanatuan in January 1945. He'd been in this camp since May of 1942, so nearly 3 years. This picture here is the many men who were liberated from that camp, and this is the morning after liberation. They had walked many, many miles to get so that they could get out of enemy-held territory. He returned home in February 1945. This picture is him embracing his wife and daughter as soon as he landed in San Francisco. His daughter was my grandmother. She was 16 at the time. Today she is 92, and she remembers this and many other events from this time period of waiting for her father to come home. Later that day, a newspaper reporter followed them home and took some staged pictures of Mimi pulling out a beautiful pie to present to Alma, and you can tell it's very staged. But shortly after he returned home from the war, he began writing a memoir of his time there. It's 250 pages long, and you can see it's typewritten, and he has a lot of handwritten corrections in it. Now, I don't remember a time when I didn't know about him being a POW or that he had written this memoir. But it was about my college years that I decided to sit down and read it in earnest. And I was surprised by what I learned. I had never heard this part of history because the Philippines is not part of the World War II narrative. If you think about it, we talk a lot about Germany, the invasion of Normandy, mostly the Nazis, and then there was something going on in Japan. But nowhere in that narrative do we specifically mention the Philippines, and I think that is tragic. When I was about 24, I started transcribing this memoir into a computer format because, that's what 24-year-olds do or something. Actually, at the time I was working for a historical publisher. These are the kind of things that we did, making manuscripts, turning manuscripts into books and things like that. So it was something I was very used to doing. As I went through, I became very interested in the fellow POWs that Som mentions throughout. Specifically, I was interested in these 3 men. First, Harry Whitman on the left, who was Som's marching companion on their way to Cabanatuan. Som became good friends with Harry, And Harry was a lot younger than Psalm, and Psalm mentions in his memoir hoping that Harry returned home and was able to fulfill all the dreams and plans he had shared with Psalm. The second man is Hinckley, whose horrific death Alma Psalm described in the beginning of the memoir. He referred to Hinckley as poor bastard, and Hinckley's story is just heartbreaking. Lastly, Major Pickack, who likely saved my great-grandfather's life the very first day they became prisoners of war because he spoke Japanese. So I dug into their lives. I am a family historian, and I wanted to see what I could find. So I started with Whitman, and I discovered that he was on a transport ship, a Japanese transport ship, that was bombed by an American plane, and he died in that bombing. So he never returned home to do all of those things he had told Psalm about. Hinckley, I already knew his death because Psalm had described it, but I discovered his early life and his family and other things, which I thought was incredible. And then lastly, Major Pickack. We're going to go a little bit more into him. So I knew about 4 things about Major Pickack when I started researching him. I knew he was a U.S. Marine major. I knew he spoke fluent Japanese. I knew he was captured on Corregidor Island at the same time as my great-grandfather. And I knew that his last name was Pickack. So I went into a POW database searching for Pickack, and I found nothing. At that point, I reframed my search, and I looked for U.S. Marine majors captured on Corregidor who had a last name similar to Pickack or at least beginning with a P. And I found a Major Frank Piecyk. Piecyk seemed a very likely choice to be the Pickack that my great-grandfather remembered. And it wouldn't surprise me if he got some of these last names wrong because it had been several years since these events had taken place. And the fact there's like 130 men in this memoir that he mentions, the fact that he gets so many names close or right on is just amazing to me. So I started researching even more about Frank Piecyk. And I found a 1929 Marine muster roll. And it says that Piecyk was an attaché to the American Embassy in Tokyo, Japan, for the purpose of acquiring knowledge of the Japanese language. So, yes, he spoke Japanese. I had found my Marine major, whose last name began with a P, captured with my great-grandfather, spoke fluent Japanese. As I did more research, I became convinced that Piecyk was the man who had saved my grandfather's life on that day of surrender. I even found that Piecyk, in early mornings, like 3 o'clock in the morning of December 8th, 1941, he had jumped into the sidecar of a motorcycle and ridden through the Marine barracks where they were staying in the Philippines, shouting, "War is declared! War is declared!" because they had just received word of the Pearl Harbor bombings, and he always just seemed like a modern-day Paul Revere. So after I learned so much about these 3 men, I was hooked, and I wanted to find out as much as I could about all 130 or so men that Saul mentioned in the memoir. So I started looking for these men, 1, to identify them, and 2, to find their before, during, and after, if there was an after the war. And I found about 95% of them and discovered their lives. So once I had all this information, I needed to decide what should I do with it. And after several years, I decided that I wanted to create a podcast that told their stories. But the problem was that my great-grandfather's memoir told a very small portion of World War II in the Philippines. He was on a ship for most of the time that the actual battles and fighting were going on. He spent a month on the war-torn Corregidor, and he spent the rest of the time in the Cabanatuan POW camp. But there was nothing about the invasion of the Philippines by the Japanese, nothing about the battles of Bataan and things like that, the Bataan Death March, transportation to Japan aboard hell ships, work camps in Japan. So I expanded the scope of my project to eventually tell the story of the war in the Philippines from beginning to end. And the way that I would do that is use POWs whose wartime experience is highlighted that portion of the war to tell those things. And so each episode tells the whole story of the individual, but also is part of an overarching thing to tell the story of the war in the Philippines. I decided to call my podcast Left Behind because these men, Americans and Filipinos alike, and there was 75 to 100,000 men, they were left behind by the U.S. government. The Philippines was supposed to be a stronghold during World War II in the Pacific area, but the Japanese invasion crippled it fast and devastatingly. The United States then decided that they would have a Europe first strategy in this war. They put their efforts and all of everything toward Europe, effectually leaving behind all these men. They knew that this island would likely fall, and they just left them there. And so that's why I call it Left Behind, when America surrendered in World War II. And my very first episode was of Frank Pisak and him driving through that Marine barracks in the motorcycle shouting that war was declared. Today I published nearly 60 episodes, and I've highlighted more than 75 American servicemen, nurses, prisoners of war, Filipino servicemen, civilians, and I plan to keep going. And the stories I find are just incredible. There's some somewhat well-known faces, like these three men who were the Medal of Honor winners on Bataan. On the left, we have Alexander Nininger, who was the first Medal of Honor recipient in World War II. He received that award for taking a bag of grenades and a rifle and jumping into an enemy foxhole. When they found his body, he had taken out several soldiers and as well as an officer. The man in the middle is Jose Calugas. He is the only Filipino in World War II to have received the Medal of Honor. And lastly, Willibald Bianchi, who was the third and final man on Bataan to receive the Medal of Honor. But I also told stories about Jim Daly, who was Willibald Bianchi's best friend in the Philippines. He's pictured here holding a little monkey that they had befriended during their time on Bataan. Jim Daly was wounded in action in the very final days before Bataan fell. He was hit by a machine gun bullet near his hip. It shattered his hip. And so he was in the hospital in a full body cast when the Bataan surrendered to the Japanese. Thus, he couldn't be evacuated or go on the Bataan Death March with the rest of the men captured on Bataan. He remained in the field hospital for several months and was transferred then to a prison in Manila, where he stayed for the rest of the war. And because of his serious injuries and he wasn't able to move around very well, he wasn't ever sent to Japan or into the work camps, and he survived the war and came home. This is a picture of Jim Daly's family. It was taken before the war, shortly before Jim sailed for the Philippines in 1941. Next to him is his mother, followed by his three siblings, and then his father. Now, his mother is looking down, and one reason that she might be looking down and slightly dejected is because that day she kept telling the family, this is the last time we will all be together. This is the last time we will all be together. And that premonition actually became true. The boy next to her, who's kind of peeking out from behind it next to her, is the youngest son of the family. And he was in the Air Corps in France, and his plane crashed during shortly after D-Day, and he died. So this picture captures the very last time this family was together before the war and together forever. I also discovered the life story of Eunice Hatchett. This woman was incredible. She was part of the Army Nursing Corps, and she was a lieutenant. She was stationed at Field Hospital No. 1 during the Battle of Bataan. She was able to escape the islands with about 10 other nurses right before the islands fell to the Japanese forces, and she ended up in Australia, where this picture was taken. Now, when I found this picture of these two nurses in Australia, the caption just said, American nurses in Australia who escaped the Philippines. They didn't identify her specifically, but if you take a look at the person on the left and then the person in the very right of the second photo, that is obviously her. And I thought it was just amazing that I found this photo of her randomly on the internet that wasn't even with her name in it. Once she got home, she was welcomed home to a hero's welcome in her small Texas town. And then the Army Nursing Corps sent her to Hollywood to be an advisor for the film So Proudly We Hail, which came out in 1943 and was about the nurses on Bataan during the Battle of Bataan. After that, she was assigned to an Army medical unit, which was sent to England. And then 6 weeks after D-Day, they went into Normandy and followed Patton's army from France into Belgium and then finally Germany. So Eunice Hatchett literally did the whole war, right? She went from the Pacific theater back home all the way to the European theater. It's just an amazing story. And there's also a little romance, a worldwide romance that is in the mix of it too, but I'll let you listen to the whole episode to find out more about that. This man is Father William Cummings. When he was about 39 years old in 1940, he went to Manila in the Philippines to be a missionary. When the war started and the Americans were leaving Manila, withdrawing to the Bataan Peninsula, William Cummings decided that he was going to join the army as a chaplain and follow them over. So a couple things to know about Father William Cummings. He was in his early 40s when he joined as a chaplain. He had severe back problems. He had back surgery before he came to the Philippines, and they almost didn't want to let him come as a missionary because of his back problems. And he was just people could describe him as frail looking in general. Father Cummings spent a lot of his time at the field hospitals, especially number 1, which you can see here in this picture. Now, the wards at this hospital weren't in buildings. They were open-air pavilions. I imagine them like picnic pavilions with just like a metal roof and then some like pillars holding that roof up. You can kind of see that in the background of this photograph. On Easter morning of 1942, the Japanese Air Force bombed this hospital on purpose. They came through and they did one bombing and strafing run. And then there was a pause. And during that pause, they could hear the planes coming back. So Cummings grabs a chair in the middle of the ward. He stands up on it, raises his hand high above his head, and starts reciting the Lord's Prayer as the first bombs start falling. He stayed there for the entire bombing run. A bomb even went off very close to where he was, and a piece of shrapnel embedded itself in his arm. So he stood there, arms in the air, blood dripping down his arms, and reciting the Lord's Prayer. When the bombing run was finally over, he asked a friend to take over for him and he went to get first aid. This, though, was considered a miracle because the portion where he was standing remained intact and standing, whereas other parts of the hospital, the roofs had collapsed and equipment and men had been blown up into the jungle and things like that. So this was considered a miracle, and at one point, Father Cummings had been nominated for sainthood. He's also the chaplain who is credited with coining the phrase, "There's no atheists in foxholes," although there's not a lot of good evidence that he did, in fact, coin that phrase. Father Cummings died on board a prisoner transport ship taking him to Japan. It was bombed by a U.S. plane who didn't realize the unmarked ship was carrying American prisoners of war. I found and told the stories of these 3 sailors who were under the command of my great-grandfather Al-Masam. As American forces and ships were leaving Manila, some ordered these men to go and destroy some Navy warehouses and all the supplies in them so that they wouldn't fall into Japanese hands. So these 3 men and another who I never found a picture for went and did that. But by the time they were done, it was too late to get to Bataan, and they were stuck in Manila with the Japanese occupation force coming in any moment. So they pretended to be American civilians and were eventually put into the Santo Tomas civilian internment camp in Manila. About a year after their incarceration there, the Japanese military realized that these men were American military and they arrested them and put them in the dungeons of Fort Santiago. Now, Fort Santiago was built in like the 1500s, and so its dungeons were legit. In fact, some of them, even to this day, fill up at high tide with water, and POWs sometimes drowned down there when they were being kept there. Well, these 4 men were in the dungeons. They didn't Well, these 4 men, they spent about 2.5 months in those dungeons. They survived and were taken to Cabanatuan, where a surprised Al-Massam was reunited with them. Eventually, all 4 men were transported to other Japanese camps on the Japan Islands, and they all came home after the war. I've even done stories about some famous photographs from the Philippines during this time period, like this one, which is a fairly iconic Bataan Death March photo. Interesting thing about this photo is that it actually wasn't taken during the Bataan Death March. These men were captured the day before Bataan surrendered, and so they weren't technically on the Bataan Death March, although they had to do a lot of marching. I learned the stories of the 3 men who were in the front of this photograph, and the one who's in the 3rd one in, he has like the dirt streaming down his face and he's looking up to somebody. He was actually very sick at this time, and he died later that day, and his body has never been found. This is one of the last photographs taken on Corregidor Island before it fell. It was taken in one of the island's tunnels. It's the finance department. I was able to identify all of these men that are in this photo. Oh, well, almost all these men. The one in the very back, number 7, whose back is turned. But I looked at some historical sources and people had tried identifying them before. But I actually discovered that I think a couple of those original identifications were incorrect, and I've been able to correct them and know which person is which. But I did an episode telling the stories of the 4 men who were in the most front part of this. Number 1, 2, 14, and 15. Only one of these men returned home. These 18 men had served together on the USS Quail. And when all of the islands surrendered to Japanese forces on May 6, 1942, they decided they wanted to try to escape. They got this diesel boat launch. It's about the length of a school bus. And they sailed quietly out of Manila Bay under the cover of darkness. Then they made their way through the rest of the Philippine islands, through open sea, through the East Indies, which we can call Indonesia today, and finally down to Darwin, Australia. And they made it. They all made it. Through rough seas, rough weather. It was amazing. I told the story of Irvin Strobing, the man on the left-hand side. He sent out the last message in Morse code from Corregidor Island before it fell. It was a series of messages over the morning of May 6, 1942, when he just basically was tapping out a play-by-play of the invasion of the Corregidor Island. It's very interesting. He didn't know if that message had been received. He was just typing out and hoping that someone would get it. At the last part, he's like, "Tell my mom I love her, and this is my name, and this is where she lives." So unbeknownst to him, that message and a translation so people could understand it rather than just being dots and dashes, it was broadcast around the United States a few weeks later, and he became a celebrity of sorts, but he didn't know any of this until he was liberated from a POW camp in Japan in fall of 1945. He came home to a much bigger hero welcome than he could have ever imagined. The man in the middle is Ray Hunt, and I love his story. First, he was on the Bataan Death March, but he escaped. He just jumped into the weeds on the side of the road into a ditch. It was very risky. Most men who tried anything like that would have been shot on sight, but he made it. He was very sick, and he spent months recuperating at some escaped POW camps high up in the mountains. At one point, one of those camps was raided by Japanese forces, but Ray was in the outhouse when that happened. So he was able to slip from the outhouse into the jungle and evade capture yet again. He eventually started his own little guerrilla unit, and they spread misinformation. And then he combined that group with a larger group, and he became like a lieutenant in that larger guerrilla group. He was a very wanted man by the Japanese. At one point, he said something like they knew what my favorite food was, what brand of cigarette I liked to smoke, but they never knew where I was. He had a big price on his head. He was given the opportunity to leave the Philippines via submarine before the Americans reinvaded, but he declined it, saying he needed to stay with his men. His story is remarkable. And the woman on the very right, her name is Lucy Wilson. She was also an Army nurse. She got out of the Philippines on the very last submarine to run through the blockade, the Japanese blockade around the islands, pick up some last passengers, mainly nurses, and then sneak back through the blockade. After 2 weeks underwater, they found themselves in Darwin, Australia. And when she got home to the United States, the U.S. military was like, you've served your turn overseas. You don't have to go back. But Lucy had left behind a fiancé in the Philippines. He had been captured on Bataan and part of the Bataan. So she became a flight nurse. These nurses flew into battle zones and got wounded men into the planes and flew them back to hospitals. Sometimes they were landing in active battle zones, like people dodging bullets as they're loading their planes. She spent a year hopping around the Pacific on these flights, always trying to see if she could somehow find her fiancé, Dan, just asking, where's Dan? Where's Dan? Eventually in the Philippines, she heard from some friends of his that he died. He was on board one of the POW transport ships that had gone down and been bombed by American planes. So at that point, she came home and her fiancé has passed away and she's trying to move on with her life. But about 6 months later, she gets a telegram from Dan saying, I'm alive and I'm back in the United States. And he had survived that transport ship and he'd survived through the Japanese POW camp, been rescued, and they met up in New Mexico and they got married just a short time later. I've told the story of Filipinos and their brave service in defense of their own country. The man on the left is Marcos Macoro. He served with his father in a coast artillery unit. The man in the middle is Dan Figuracion. He was a part of a cavalry unit, and he took part in the very last horse-mounted cavalry charge in American military history. And that happened in a very small town called Morone on the Bataan Peninsula. The man on the right is Felipe Fernandez. He was a sergeant, and in the last hours of the Battle of Bataan, he led the men under his command in an escape to Corregidor Island, so they all avoided the Bataan Death March because of Felipe. I have two main aims with this project. The first one is to increase awareness of World War II in the Philippines. I mentioned before that the Philippines isn't part of the standard World War II narrative. People, when I talk to them, are shocked that we surrendered so many men and that the Philippines was even part of World War II. And that I want to change that. I want it to become part of the narrative. These men sacrificed so much and they were left behind by their government at the time and they're being forgotten to history. And I think that's just tragic. And along with that, my next aim is I want to keep these individuals' memories alive, to tell the world what they did, who they were, what they fought and often died for. So going forward, I'm about a year and a half into this podcast, and we've barely gotten through this first 5 or 6 months of the war. We're going to go inside Cabanatuan POW camp, which was the largest Japanese-held POW camp during the war, and we'll go inside various work camps in the Philippines. I want to take a look at the Mexican, Native, African, and Japanese American servicemen who were serving in the Philippines at this time. We're going to look at guerrilla fighters, civilians, and the underground movement. We're going to talk about the Philippine liberators, the Americans who came in and recaptured the Philippines. And then, if I'm still going, we're going to move to stories of men and women in the other parts of the Pacific. I want to hear from you. I want to know what you think of the podcast. I also want to hear if you know of men or women whose stories I should tell on the podcast. Also, if you know or part of organizations, people, projects, anything that has to do with the war in the Philippines, I love to spotlight them in some of the mini episodes I do. So let's chat. You can contact me through my website, leftbehindpodcast.com, on Instagram or on Facebook, and I can't wait to hear from you. Have a fantastic day.